to the continuation of our course on the secrets of Noah's Ark. I want to follow up and expound on a few things that were included in the first course. But first, I'd like to point out to you a reference book which I think is fascinating and very enjoyable for anyone who is interested in biblical history. There's a book called Door le Door, Generation to Generation, that's published by Feldheim, and you can find it on feldheim.com. It's also on our list of recommended books, and it's actually a linear timeline that folds out to many, many pages, illustrated from the beginning of creation, the initial 7 days of creation, all the way to the present time. And it's linear, and it includes the biblical history and many important points in Jewish history and world history that happened since then. So it's a very good and a very concise reference point, and it's even got blank pages at the end, so you can fill in your own continuation of the history from the time that the book was printed recently. So in the first class, we reviewed the dimensions of the ark and pointed out that as of our generation, only a few supertankers and giant cruise ships have been built on the scale of size of Noah's Ark. But how big actually was Noah's Ark? Well, the dimensions are given precisely by God in the Bible, prophetically from God to Noah, and it's given as 300 cubits long by 50 cubits wide by 30 cubits high. And as we said before, that gives us a volume of 450,000 cubic cubits. And how's that for a dimension? And we also said that this number that you come up with, 450,000 cubic cubits, is connected with the gematria, the numerical value in Hebrew of one of God's holy names, and the 10,000 of myriads, which refers to the enclothing of the different worlds, the 10 aspects of the different worlds, one within the other. Gives us a spiritual connection of the dimensions given by God to the spiritual intention to be communicated by God in the size of the ark. And this was all talked about in more detail in the first class. But now to put it into numbers that we can relate to, converting from the cubits to feet, you get 627 feet long by 104.5 feet wide by about almost 63 feet high. But I understand that the great majority of our listeners are not in the United States or Great Britain, so you're more used to speaking about meters instead of feet. So for your benefit, let's convert that over. It's 190.5 meters long by 32 meters wide by 19 meters high, approximately. But now how do I come up with this conversion from a cubit to a foot or a meter? How long is a cubit, as is mentioned in the Bible? So most estimates that what you find today for a cubit are going to be in the Jewish literature, because there's these different things in Jewish law that are dependent on how many cubits you have. The opinions are ranging that it's in the range of about 17.5 to 20.5 inches, as it applies in the post-Sinai Torah law for Jews. However, Noah was in the world a very long time before that. So what was the cubit that Noah was using as his measuring rod? Well, in the book called History of Egypt by William Petrie, which you can find on Amazon.com. I don't necessarily recommend the book, but I'll give you this this particular point out from it. I'm sure that most of it is dealing with the idolatry of Egypt. But on this point, the author writes that in ancient Egyptian writing, which was hieroglyphs, it was discovered a mention of the sacred Hebrew cubit. And this is it's actually pre-Sinai times, when the ancient Egyptians had interaction with the Hebrews at that time. And you find a size there in that inscription, which was corresponding to 25 inches. So that size of 25 inches for the sacred Hebrew cubit is the size that our author, engineer Joseph Smith, used for Joseph Silver used for his engineering analysis. And that's the basis of the sizes that I'm quoting to you in feet or in meters. So now, to review a little bit also about Noah himself. Noah was born in the year 1056 from creation. Now, Adam himself died at the age of 930, which was 126 years before Noah was born. But what you find here, due to the very long lifetimes of the people who are mentioned in that part of the biblical history, what we see is that Noah's father, Lamech, and his grandfather, Methuselah, were living at the same time along with Adam's son, his righteous son Seth, and they learned directly from the very first man who was created by God's own miraculous power, and also who were knowledgeable in secrets of Torah, and these were passed on from Adam and Seth to Methuselah and Lamech to Noah and Noah's righteous son, who was Shem, who after the flood, as many of you will know, founded a yeshiva of Torah learning. Now, Noah did not marry his wife Naamah until he was 498 years old. And his first son, Japheth, or as you often find in the transliterations, Japheth, was born 2 years later, putting Japheth at the age of 100 at the time of the flood. And so why was Noah waiting for 498 years to get married when we see that his ancestors married and had children at a much earlier age? So we explained in the first class that this was instructions from God so that his oldest child would not be over 100 years old at the time of the flood when God judged the generation. And that's because in those early days when the lifespan was so much longer, the age of bar mitzvah, meaning the age when the person becomes liable for violations of the commandments, which in those times that was the 6 commandments that were given to Adam, the 7th one being given later to Noah, forming the 7 laws of Noah. So none of Noah's children were liable to be punished if they had done any violations of the commandments by the time that the flood came. And as we explained in the first class, if the children had been over the age of their so-called bar mitzvah, they were over the age of 100 and been righteous, they would have need to be saved in the flood, and Noah would have had to build an ark for each one of them because, as we said, it was Noah specifically who had spiritual connection to this task of building the ark, and not anyone else in his generation. So now, continuing in this class, I want to speak more about the flood itself. And why a flood? Because we know that God can accomplish His will by any means that He wants. So why would He choose to destroy humanity and save a remnant through this process of a worldwide flood and building the ark as a means to survive the flood? So because this is a story in the Torah, and Torah in Hebrew is related to hora'ah, which means teaching. Everything in the Torah, which is transmitted to us, is for us to learn lessons for our life, for our divine service. So there must be something specific that God wanted us to learn from the fact that He brought a flood. So there are a couple of things. The first reason that the world was destroyed by water, everything on land, because water has the effect of purification. That the world, the people, the animals, everything had been spiritually defiled by the great sins and evil of the people, and the flood of water brought a purification to the world. The other question is, why did it rain for 40 days and 40 nights? And God makes a special point of saying in the Torah that that is the length of time that the rains continued. So this was also to teach us about the reason for God's wrath that brought the flood, so that it should not be repeated again. And Rashi, in the verse of Genesis 7:4, which I'll read to you, God instructed to Noah before the flood came that in 7 more days I will send rain upon the earth, 40 days and 40 nights. I will blot out all existence that I have made from upon the face of the earth. So Rashi comments there that why the 40 days? Because of the sexual sins of the people of the generation. That they conceived children by adultery and incest, and it takes 40 days for an embryo from conception to develop to the point that it's judged in Torah law as a human life. So the people of the generation troubled God by forming fetuses through adultery and incest, and those fetuses formed in 40 days, and that's why the generation was punished by the 40 days of the flood. Okay, for the human beings, we can understand. But why the necessity to destroy the animal life on earth? So there's 2 reasons that are given for this. One reason is because, again, an extension of these great sexual sins that the people did was that they also engaged in rampant bestiality. The humans mated and even officially married animals, and they trained the animals also to crossbreed with other species, which was not the nature of the animals, but the people in their depravity introduced that into the animal life. So the animals also became corrupted. So it was, and they had the animals and the birds had corrupted in their nature. And Rashi makes a special point of saying that the few animals that were from all the animals that were taken into the ark to be saved were animals that had not corrupted their ways through the cross mating. So this supports an interesting theory, which I'm going to discuss later on, which is that the animals that Noah brought into the ark were very young animals, for a few reasons. Number one, being young animals, they would take up less space, they would eat less food, And also, they would not have reached the time of maturity, so they would not have made it yet. So they would not have had the opportunity to engage in that depraved behavior. The second reason that's given for the animals being destroyed is that God actually created everything in the world for the sake of human beings. So the animals are there for the purpose of human needs in the world. And if humans have been wiped out, then there's no need for the animal life. That's another reason that's given. So we also have one other point on what we can learn from the fact that God brought the flood, which is the statement that God made to Noah in the very first verse in chapter 7, that God said to Noah, "Come to the ark, you and all your household, for it is you that I have seen to be righteous before me in this generation." That going into the ark was to be the means of saving Noah and his family from the waters of the flood. In Hebrew, the verse says, "Go into the teva." The word in Hebrew for ark is teva, but teva is also the same word for a word. A word in Hebrew is translated as teva. So it's saying, go into the word. Go into the Word of God. Means going into Torah and the word that's directed to God, which is prayer. So through learning Torah and through prayer to God, you can actually save and redeem yourself from the spiritual waters, of the flood of negativity and secularism that is and difficulties in your mundane life of earning a living and concerns with anything that distracts you from your divine service or might tend to bring you down. Go into the word of Torah, go into the words of prayer, and that will be your saving ark that will keep you connected with God. And not only that, but you could bring other people also into that ark, into that word of God, to help them also to be spiritually protected and spiritually secure in their lives. As we also mentioned in the first class, this history that there was a worldwide flood is not only that we find it in the Torah, it's also found in the ancient traditions of peoples from all over the world. Going into the ancient, some would consider to be mythology, but everything comes from a source. In Samaria, in the Middle East, in Asia, you have in India, Burma, China, Sumatra, Borneo, the Dutch New Guinea Islands, Fiji, the Melanesians. They all have ancient traditions that there was a worldwide flood with animals, birds, and humanity being saved in a boat by a righteous family. We also have these stories among the Indian tribes in North America and native cultures in Mexico, also in ancient Greece and among African tribes. So this points to the fact that all people coming initially from Noah and his sons, carried into different parts of the world, carried with them this knowledge that there had been a worldwide flood. So now back to the discussion of the engineering of the ark. The Torah gives a lot of detailed information about how the waters of the flood rose, to what depth they rose, and the length of time, the rate of the rising of the water, and so on. And then at the end of the year of the flood, It speaks about how much the waters had receded over what period of time. And what is the reason of giving us all these details about the rising and receding of the water? So from that information, and as Rashi in his explanations in those chapters of the Torah, it gives you information about how deep the ark was sunk into the water. So how do we know this? That from the rate of the rise and the recession of the ark, you can calculate the depth that the ark was sunk in before it landed on land. From this, knowing the length and the width of the ark, you can get the volume of water that was displaced by the ark as it was fully loaded with the animals and the people and all the payload, the food and so on. So from this volume of water that was displaced through Archimedes' principle, you can get the weight of that amount of water, and that gives you the weight of the ark when it was fully loaded with all the animals, all their food, and the people, everything that was in the ark. And what that comes out to, if you do the calculation, is approximately 51,271 English tons, which is 46,512 metric tons. Or multiplied by 1,000, that's 465,120 kilograms. And you can convert that over to pounds, you get 102,542,000 pounds of the fully loaded ark. So how much of that was the weight of the ark, and how much of it was the weight of the payload? Well, it says in the Torah that the ark was built from gopher wood, which has a density of 28 pounds per cubic foot. So if you assume that there's 2 layers of squared beams forming the hull and the decks and the bulkheads, now Joseph Silver, in his analysis, estimates a total weight of the wood on the ark of 31,697,480 pounds. So if you subtract the weight of the structure of the ark from the total weight of the fully loaded ark, you get the weight of the payload, which was the weight of the animals and all their food and the few humans that were on the ark, whatever else it was that they brought in with them. And it comes out to 70,844,400 pounds, or that would be 35,422 English tons. Quite amazing. But how did Noah maintain a food supply for all these animals and for the people on the ark? If he only brought in a full amount of food in the beginning, how would it last for a whole year without spoiling? And that would put the ark at its maximum weight right at the beginning. Then the animals are going to actually grow and gain weight as they go along. So there's a few clues about how to understand the ecosystem that was going on with the ark that provided for the food for the animals. So Noah is described at the time of his birth, to the verse in the Torah, that his father prophetically said about the young baby, that he will bring us rest from our hands, toil in the work of the soil, from the ground that God has cursed. This is in chapter 5, verse 29 in Genesis. And Noah was to grow up to be a revolutionary expert in farming techniques. We also see that after the flood, we have the story that Noah took grapevines, which he had saved in the ark, and he planted a vineyard, and he made wine. Now for this, you need not just one vine, you need a number of vines. And a sapling or a shoot of a grapevine is not going to last for a whole year if you just pull it out and put it in a bag. It had to be planted. Right? So it must have been that Noah actually planted different species of fruit plants and crops on the ark itself. So that makes sense, because how could it be that in the three levels of the ark, the bottom level being for the waste that was produced, the middle level being for all the animals, and remember we were talking about 18,000 to 36,000 animals on the ark in that space of the middle deck, and then the top deck, exactly the same size, reserved for only 8 human beings. A huge amount of wasted space. What was that top deck actually for? So Noah, being an expert farmer, could have taken the top deck and planted the entire thing with a layer of soil, planting crops, and as it says in the Torah, God commanded Noah to make a light, a skylight in the top of the ark.